We've been looking at different images and symbols and figures of the church throughout the book of Revelation. And so far we've gotten through Revelation chapter 11, which had a number, three specific references to the church as the temple, the holy city, and the two witnesses. Now we move on to chapter 12, which is an important and central chapter in the book, in that chapter 12, in essence, recapitulates the history of the church in its conflict with Satan, at least as of the time of the first coming of Christ, if not before. And chapter 12 begins by saying, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns. On his heads were 7 diadems. And his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that she would be nourished for 1,260 days." Now, there's some discussion as to who is this woman. The picture of the woman comes from Genesis 37:9, namely the dream that Joseph had of the woman with the crowns and so on and so forth, and everyone bowing down to him. The central feature of the woman, of course, is that she is the mother of the Messiah. So some commentators think that she is Mary. Others think that the woman is Israel, who gave birth to the Messiah. However, the heavenly woman is both the mother of the Messiah and the actual church on earth, because in chapter 12, verse 17, it says, "The dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus." So, as one commentator puts it, since this heavenly woman is the mother of both Messiah and the church, it's easier to understand her in a somewhat broader sense as the ideal representative, or the ideal Zion, the heavenly representative of the people of God. But isn't it interesting that we've seen in different places how different images or symbols can represent the same thing? So here we see this woman representing probably the ideal Zion, in other words, both the Old Testament believers and the New, but also she gave birth to her other children, which clearly is the church. So the church can be seen in both the woman and the children in verse 17. Now, she gave birth to a male son who obviously is Jesus Christ. And note that Satan, the devil, the dragon, stood before the woman so that he might devour the child when he was born. And, again, this is an image, this is symbolism, but that was played out in real life, because King Herod sought to have baby Jesus destroyed, and so had all the male children under the age of 2 years old killed and murdered. That was playing out in history on the earth. What is shown here in chapter 12 symbolically. So these symbols do oftentimes have particular historical references. Now, when we move to chapter 14, we see yet another image of the church. particularly at the end of chapter 14. It's talking about the judgment. And in verses 15 and 16, it's talking about the harvest. And it says, another angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. Then he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Now, it then goes on in verses 17 through 20. So that's a harvest of grain. But in 17 through 20, it goes on talking about there was another angel. He also had a sharp sickle, and that he was told, put your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because the grapes are ripe. So the angel swung his sickle to the earth, gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth, threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God, and the winepress was trodden outside of the city, and blood came out from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. Now, I think that what is going on here is that the grain harvest described in verses 15 and 16 is the harvest of the redeemed, namely the church, and that is distinguished from the harvest of the grapes, which represent the harvest of the unbelievers. And we see, you may recall that in the parable in Matthew 13, the parable of the harvest, let me just get this here. It talks about the wheat and the tares, and he talks about the harvest is the end of the age, and the angels are the reapers. Similar imagery is being given here in the book of Revelation, where the harvest is obviously the end of the age, and the angels are the reapers. But I think that the reference to the harvest of the grapes, since it talks about they are thrown into the winepress of the wrath of God, that obviously cannot be referring to the church. And furthermore, we noticed a distinction. The grain harvest takes place in only one action, namely reaping. There's no threshing or winnowing, but the grape harvest takes place in multiple actions: gathering, throwing down, and then treading down. And finally, reaping in the New Testament always has a positive image of bringing people into the kingdom, not judgment on the ungodly. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing, again, different images are describing different aspects of the church, and both in terms of its beginning with the ideal woman and then her children in the wilderness, where she is protected. And again, in a sense, we are in the wilderness now. We undergo persecution by Satan, but God is still protecting us. That doesn't mean everyone is going to live. I mean, a lot of people are martyred, and we saw back from Revelation 6. The martyrs are another image of the church. But here at the end of chapter 14, we're seeing the end of the church. It is the good harvest, as was indicated in Jesus's parable of the wheat and the tares. We move on. In chapter 17, verse 14, there's yet another image of the church. It says that it's talking about people, and it says the ungodly. And in chapter 17, verse 14, it says, "These will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is the Lord of lords and King of kings. And those who are with him are called the chosen, are the called, the chosen, and the faithful." So we're seeing a picture here in Revelation 17 of those who are with the Lord when he comes, and they are called the called, the chosen, and the faithful. Now, here the church is clearly identified since it refers to the people who are with the Lamb. That can only be Christians, okay? Furthermore, everywhere else in the New Testament, after Christ's resurrection, when it talks about or describes people who are called, chosen, or elected, and faithful, it is always referring to Christians. And in your book, I have multiple citations. So again, you look at the language that's being used here. This is language that can only refer to the church. So, and again, these are describing different aspects. All Christians we're going to be with Christ when he comes again, as will be indicated later on in Revelation 19. But as we saw from Ephesians chapter 2, we're with him now. He's raised us up with him. And now it's specifically saying it's not only that Christians are sealed by God, we are called by him. We are chosen or elected by him, and the true church is the faithful church. Then we move on. In Revelation 18, verse 4, it's talking, this chapter, and chapter 17 and 18 are talking about Babylon the Great. And in 18, verse 4, it says, I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive her plagues. So the reference is to my people. Now, my people can only be those who are united with and faithful to the Lord. In other words, the church. Now, John says, come out of her, my people. And this is another example of intertextual allusions, because that statement alludes to Isaiah 48, Isaiah 52, Jeremiah 50, 50, and 51. In all of those passages, Isaiah and Jeremiah were saying, get out of Babylon. And so what John is doing is going back to the Old Testament, where it was talking about a literal Babylon, but now using the same type of phraseology in talking about spiritual Babylon. So again, and just as literal Babylon was an actual city, John is universalizing this. So he's not talking about, and since the true Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, is a worldwide entity, as we will discuss later on, he can't be talking about leaving the earth. But the point that he is making is, don't be seduced by the great harlot. In other words, don't have the mindset of Babylon, don't have the worldly values and priorities. As Jesus said elsewhere, we are in the world, but we're not of the world. So make sure, come out of her mentally, spiritually, in terms of your affections and your actions and your mindset, even though we are living in the world. But then in Revelation 19, and he will use similar imagery in Revelation 21 and 22, he talks about the bride. So in Revelation 19, in verses 7 through 9, it's talking about the marriage supper of the Lamb. And it says, let us rejoice and be glad and give glory to him, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was given to her to clothe herself in fine linen, bright and clean, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. Then he said to me, write, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are true words of God. So Jesus is frequently called the bridegroom, and once again, what John is doing, though, is taking an Old Testament image relating to the restoration of Israel, found in Isaiah 49, Isaiah 61, and Isaiah 62, of the bride, and applying it to the church. And in Revelation 21:9, New Jerusalem is described both as the bride and as the wife of the Lamb. And so what John is doing, once again, is building on and using Old Testament imagery that had applied to the nation of Israel, reapplying it to the church, universalizing it, and you might say spiritualizing it, showing that the church is the true spiritual fulfillment of which old Israel was only a type or a shadow. And I think one commentator makes a very good point that since the church is described both as the bride and the wife, this commentator says, the woman as bride evokes the notion of newness and ardor, and the reference to Jerusalem as wife suggests enduring fidelity and fruitfulness. And thus, as the bride and the wife, John is telling us the city's beauty and the intimacy and fruitfulness of the relationship between God and the redeemed in the age to come. But that all begins now. And so, again, the bride of Christ contrasts with the harlot of the world. And it's also very interesting that it talks about the marriage supper of the Lamb, which contrasts with the great supper of God, because in the marriage supper of the Lamb, which was, I read from Revelation 19, verses 7 through 9, at the end of Revelation 19, it talks about the great supper of God. In Revelation 19, verse 17, it says to all the birds which fly in the air, "Come, assemble for the great supper of God, so that you may eat the flesh of kings and the flesh of commanders, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses, those who sit on them, the flesh of all men, both free and slaves, small and great." So you see, there's this great contrast. You either are united to the whore of Babylon or to our bridegroom. We are either the bride or like the whore. And as the bride, we're invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb, where we will feast forever, whereas those who are now united to the whore of Babylon will be eaten at the great supper of God. It's this contrast. It's one or the other. And the problem is, you see, and one of the reasons I think John is using all of this imagery is to show us that what real reality is. In our lives now, we face hard times. We don't see the end from the beginning. We don't see God's perspective. That's why John is giving us God's true perspective on the church through symbols. Then we find in Revelation 19, verse 14, it talks about the armies. He says, "And the armies which are in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, were following him on white horses." This whole section, beginning in Revelation 19, verse 11, is talking about the second coming of Christ. Now, the armies, I think, include angels, but they also include us, the church, because it's talking about they wore fine linen, and we've already seen from chapter 19, verse 8, that the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. Also, we saw from chapter 17, verse 14, that it talks about they will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are the called, the chosen, and the faithful. Now in Revelation 19, the armies are with him, and in that same passage, in Revelation 19, verse 16, he is again referred to as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So again, intertextual allusions, chapter 17 and 19 are using the same kind of language. And so we are with him, we are the called, we are also included in the armies of the Lord. That leads us to Revelation chapter 20. And so there are just four more symbols of the church. In Revelation 20, verses 4 through 6, it says, "Then I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received the mark on their forehead or on their right hand, and they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years." Now, we'll talk more about that later on, but clearly what is being talked about here is those sitting on the thrones are reference to the church. Now, some think it's the entire church, some are talking about the martyrs, but as we saw, at the end of Revelation chapter 6, since all Christians in principle are martyrs, I think what is being talked about here is, again, another image of the church. We're not talking about physical thrones. We're talking probably about heavenly thrones, or as some commentators say, the thrones are simply a reference to our authority, because remember back in Revelation 5, it says, we reign or will reign upon the earth. And so this is giving the spiritual aspect to show that we are with him. Remember, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 6, we've already been raised up and seated with him in the heavenly places. And so this, you might say, is another picture of that. Which leads in Revelation 20 and 21, the three final images that we see of the church in the book of Revelation. And I know I'm going fairly quickly for purposes of time, but these things are fleshed out in the book. In Revelation 20, verse 9, it talks about the camp of the saints. Beginning in verse 7, it says, when the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison. And by the way, we're going to talk about the 1,000 years later. I think the 1,000 years is a period of time. It's another symbolic period of time for the time that we are in now. It does not follow Christ's coming again, but it precedes it. Christ's coming again will end the 1,000 years. So anyway, when the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison, and he will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. And they came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. So the camp of the saints and the beloved city are two other images for the church. Now, again, don't fall into the trap of literalism. Neither the camp nor the city is a literal camp or a city. Like the other images we have seen, they are figurative and symbolic of the church. And it is a worldwide entity, not a camp like an army camp or an individual city. It talks about, in Revelation 20, verse 9, the beloved city. And again, this is in contrast to the great city. The contrast is between that great city, Babylon the Great, and the beloved city, the New Jerusalem. And so since both are worldwide entities, the camp of the city, or the camp of the saints and the beloved city are the same, not different. They're different descriptions of the same entity. Later on, New Jerusalem is also equated with the holy city. We talked about that a little bit earlier, I think, when we were back in Revelation 11. But in Revelation 3, it identifies believers, in other words, he who overcomes, with the city of my God, Revelation 3, verse 12. And so the city of my God, the beloved city, and the holy city are all the same thing, different descriptions of the same entity. We also know that the camp of the saints and the beloved city are worldwide, because in chapter 20, verse 9, it says that Gog and Magog came up over the broad plain of the earth. Now, the New King James and the NIV translate that phrase as the breadth of the earth. And in other words, the enemies of the church spread across the breadth or the entire earth. So the camp and the city are not confined to one spot. The camp and the city represent the saints wherever they are throughout the entire earth, okay? But the camp metaphor is a warfare metaphor because we are engaged in spiritual warfare. The church always has been, and it will be until Christ comes again. Then the last two metaphors or symbols of the church, in Revelation 21, verse 3, it says, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. So his people. And again, this verse culminates a statement that recurs throughout the Bible, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, with some variations, where God says, I will be their God, and they will be my people. Well, now they are called his people. And so this phrase had been used in the Old Testament to describe Israel, but now is being reapplied to describe the church. But it's very interesting. In all the Old and New Testament passages that talk about, I will be their God and they will be my people is in the singular. But with respect to Revelation 21, verse 3, there is a lot of good textual evidence that puts it in the plural. They are his peoples. And if that is the case, then I think John is making the change from people to peoples to make it obvious that the prophecies that originally focused on Israel have now been transferred to God's people, who are out of every tribe, tongue, people in the entire world. So again, these subtle changes and the subtle use of language, I think, is just so fascinating. This is not by accident. And the final image of the church is the New Jerusalem itself. In Revelation 21, beginning in verses 1 and 2, it says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. So, in verse 2 of chapter 21, the holy city, New Jerusalem, is equated with the bride. And we've already seen that the bride can only be the church. And later on, in verses 9 and 10 of 21, it says this, one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls full of the 7 last plagues came and spoke with me, saying, come here, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God. Her brilliance was like a very costly stone, as a stone of crystal clear jasper. And so, again, I think there is obviously a physical aspect or a geographical aspect to the New Jerusalem. As we'll see later, New Jerusalem is not just a city in the new creation. It is a way of referring to the entire new heaven and new earth itself. But more importantly than that is the fact that New Jerusalem is not just a geographical description. It is explicitly and more than once equated with the bride and wife of the Lamb. So the New Jerusalem is a symbolic reference to the church itself. And so it is, you see, God's plan had always been to dwell with his holy people in a holy place. And the fact that at the end of the book, the church and the new heavens and the new earth is described, the church is in the form of a city, I think may suggest the perfect social union of the redeemed with one another and with God as the final and everlasting answer to all of society's failures throughout the course of human history. And note also, in Revelation 21, it talks about describes the city, walls and so on, and it says in verse 14, the wall of the city had 12 foundation stones, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. And later on, it talks about on the walls, in verse 12, it says, there was a great and high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates, 12 angels. The names were written on them, the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. So what this is doing is showing the unity of the Old Testament Jewish saints and the New Testament Gentile saints. But notice something. The foundation, you might think, would be Israel, but it's not. On the foundation stones are the names of the 12 apostles. Why? Because they were personally connected with Jesus, and which is showing that Jesus is the foundation for everything. So we see all of these interesting images, some very counterintuitive, but all describing different aspects of the church. And so we've seen the church from the very beginning of the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verse 1, all the way to the end. This book is written to the church, it's written for the church, and I hope by going through this, it helps us to understand symbolic language a little better. In the next lectures, we'll start going through the different sections of the book of Revelation in a little more detail.